She looked me in the eye that day, her words sharp enough to cut deeper than any blade. "You're old and weak." For a moment, the room seemed to freeze, as if even the air recoiled from her arrogance. I had spent a lifetime building strength, not just in body, but in resilience, in wisdom, in the patience that only years can teach. Yet, in her eyes, all of that was a rest dismissed with a cruel label meant to strip me of dignity. She thought her insult was power. She thought I would shrink into silence, humiliated and powerless. But what she didn't know was that her words carried no weight against the truth I had already secured. While she reveled in her mockery, a secret lay waiting in silence, one that would unravel her schemes. Because the will, signed and sealed, had already written a very different ending. Family to me had always been more than just a word. It was a fabric woven through shared meals, laughter across decades, whispered secrets, and the unspoken loyalty that held us together during storms. I was the elder, the silent anchor who had seen triumphs and hardships alike. My presence at the head of the table was not just tradition, but a symbol of continuity, a reminder that our family's roots ran deep. Yet, in the comfort of that bond, subtle cracks had begun to form that only I seemed to notice at first. She entered our circle like a shadow creeping in unnoticed, cloaked in politeness and smiles. At gatherings, her laughter seemed warm, but her eyes flickered with calculation, while others were charmed by her youth and energy. I felt the weight of her subtle dismissals, the way she interrupted me mid-story, the quick roll of her eyes. When I offered advice, the impatient sigh whenever tradition slowed her ambitions. It wasn't overt defiance. It was something sharper, more dangerous, underestimation disguised as courtesy. To the rest of the family, her presence was harmless, even refreshing. They mistook her condescension for confidence, her arrogance for strength. But I saw it differently. With every remark that hinted I was outdated, with every smirk suggesting my wisdom was irrelevant, I recognized her strategy. She wanted control. And in her eyes, I was the obstacle too frail to resist. Still, I chose silence. I listened to their laughter. I watched the bonds that tied us together stretch thinner with each passing day. And I let her believe her illusion. She underestimated me not because of what I lacked, but because of what she could not see: the patience of a lifetime, the foresight of someone who had learned to play the long game. The seeds of tension grew quietly. A misplaced comment here, a mocking glance there, the subtle isolation of my voice from family discussions. She thought she was clever, slowly erasing my influence while pretending to honor it. But beneath her underestimation lay her fatal flaw: arrogance. And arrogance blinds. For every moment she dismissed me, I grew sharper in my resolve. For every word she used to belittle, I gathered quiet strength. She was building a story in her mind where I would fade into irrelevance, where she would rise unchallenged. What she didn't realize was that the script had already been written, the ending already secured. Family bonds may have been tested, but I knew one truth she never could grasp. Blood carries memory. Legacy carries weight, and dignity, once underestimated, transforms into the sharpest weapon of all. While she sowed discord, I prepared quietly, allowing her to dig her own downfall, one underestimation at a time. The will was not born out of impulse or paranoia, was the product of years of reflection, of watching the world change and realizing how fragile legacies can become in careless hands. Long before the insults, long before the dismissals, I had sat quietly at my desk with pen in hand and heart heavy, determined to safeguard what generations before me had built. The will was not merely a legal document, it was a shield, a silent fortress designed to protect not just wealth, but the essence of everything our family name stood for. I had seen too many stories end badly, families torn apart, inheritances squandered, legacies forgotten. I promised myself ours would not be one of them. So, with deliberate care, I created a plan that could withstand arrogance, greed, and betrayal. The lawyers who helped draft it knew my intentions well. Every clause was precise, every safeguard unshakable. It was not about favoring one over another, it was about ensuring that what mattered most could never be stolen, twisted, or erased by ambition. Keeping it hidden was essential. Secrets carry their own power, and silence was my greatest ally. I told no one, not my closest friends, not even the family members I trusted most. It rested quietly in the vault of my attorney's office, its pages waiting patiently for the day when truth would be tested. To the world, I seemed vulnerable, a relic of the past easily dismissed. But in reality, I held the kind of foresight that only time and experience could teach. What the others did not understand was that the will was more than a division of property. It was a message carved in ink, spoke of resilience, of dignity, of the unshakable belief that principles outlast arrogance. Every line reflected not just material wealth, but the story of sacrifice and perseverance that had built it. It was, in essence, my voice preserved for the day others might try to silence it. And that day had come. The one who called me old and weak believed I had no fight left in me, that her underestimation would pave the way to easy triumph. What she didn't know was that long before she had entered our lives, the ending had already been written. The will stood like a lighthouse, in the storm, unseen yet unyielding, ready to illuminate the truth when the time came. Its existence was power. Not the kind of power that shouts, threatens, or boasts, but the quiet, unmovable kind that cannot be shaken by insults or arrogance. To her, I was frail. To me, she was blind, because while she plotted and schemed, I had already sealed the future. The will was not just a document, it was proof that foresight outlives foolishness, and that dignity, once tested, can roar louder than any voice raised against it. It began with small gestures, almost invisible at first, the kinds of slights that could be brushed aside as careless rather than cruel. A dismissive glance during dinner conversations, a smirk when I offered a story from years past. The subtle but cutting way she shifted her body to exclude me from the circle of attention. These were the seeds, and though others may not have noticed, I felt each one. To her, I was no longer a person of wisdom or authority. I was an obstacle, a relic, someone whose voice no longer mattered. At family gatherings, she took control of conversations with a brashness that carried no respect for history. If I spoke, she interrupted. If I advised, she rolled her eyes. My suggestions, shaped by decades of experience, were treated as though they were ramblings of someone out of touch. It was not merely disagreement. It was mockery disguised as casual dismissal. Others would sometimes laugh nervously, unsure of whether to challenge her or let the insult pass. And in those silences, her arrogance thrived. There was one afternoon I recall vividly. I had offered advice on managing a property issue, suggesting patience rather than haste. She leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and with a grin that stung more than any words, she said, "Of course, patience. That's what people say when they're too old to keep up." The room fell quiet. My daughter looked down at her hands, unwilling to meet my eyes, and in that moment, the fracture widened. She wanted everyone to see me as powerless as a shadow of my former self, and for a moment, I could feel her confidence growing from the silence around her. But I did not rise to her bait. I did not shout or defend myself with fury. My strength was not in loud defiance, but in the discipline of restraint. I sat calmly, my face steady, my voice soft. In her eyes, this silence was weakness, further proof of her victory. In truth, it was the composure of someone who understood battles are not always fought in the open. While she paraded her arrogance in front of others, I allowed her to underestimate me. And that underestimation was her greatest mistake. Her disrespect grew bolder over time. She began to treat my presence as a burden, leaving me out of decisions, making jokes about my old-fashioned ways, even speaking as if the legacy I had built was hers to claim. I could see the way she thrived on stripping me of dignity, believing she was positioning herself for control. To her, I was an inconvenience, standing between her ambition and her prize. To me, she was revealing her character one careless insult at a time. Each slight, each smirk, each condescending remark was fuel, not for anger, but for clarity. I saw more clearly with every moment that her vision of power was shallow, built on arrogance and disrespect. She thought belittling me gave her strength, but all it did was expose her weakness. And so I remained composed. Where she mocked, I endured. Where she dismissed, I observed. Quietly, patiently, I let her show the family who she truly was, while I held within me the unshakable truth of the will already signed. She thought my silence meant defeat. She could not see that my silence was preparation, the calm before the reckoning she never saw coming. It was a moment etched in fire, the kind of confrontation that strips away every pretense and leaves only raw truth behind. She stood in the middle of the living room, her voice sharp and deliberate, and with no hesitation, the words cut through the air like a blade. You're old, you're weak. You don't matter anymore. For a heartbeat, the room froze. The weight of those words pressed against my chest, heavy and merciless, as though she had tried to erase a lifetime of effort and dignity with a single sentence. Pain rushed through me, not physical, but deeper, rooted in humiliation. To be spoken to like that in my own home, surrounded by the walls that had witnessed my struggles and triumphs, was a wound no one could see, but everyone could feel. My daughter shifted uncomfortably, her silence almost as sharp as the insult itself. Neighbors who had gathered for a casual visit looked down at their feet, unsure whether to intervene. And in that silence, I felt the sting of betrayal harder than ever. But pain, as piercing as it was, did not break me. Beneath the ache rose something steadier, something forged over years of endurance. Her words were meant to crush, but instead, they stirred a spark, a reminder of everything I had built, everything I had safeguarded, everything she could never take from me. She saw frailty in my aging hands and tired steps. What she could not see was the steel running through my spirit. Quiet but unshakable. I looked at her not with rage, but with an unflinching calm. Her eyes sought triumph in my silence. But what she found instead was a reflection of her own arrogance staring back. My restraint unsettled her. She expected shouting, perhaps even tears, something that would validate her belief in my weakness. But I gave her none of it. My silence was not surrender, its defiance cloaked in dignity. The air in the room thickened. Her voice, which moments earlier had carried so much confidence, began to waver as she tried to push further. "You should step aside," she insisted, gesturing with a careless hand. "This family needs someone strong, someone who knows how to handle things." Her smirk returned, but it faltered at the edges, betraying the uncertainty beneath. The louder she spoke, the clearer it became to everyone watching that her strength was nothing but a performance. Inside me, emotions churned hurt, yes, but also clarity. This was the breaking moment, not for me, but for her. For in exposing her contempt so boldly, she revealed herself to the very people whose respect she had tried to claim. Every dismissive word she had whispered before, every mocking glance, every small act of belittlement, all of it came rushing back to them. In this instant, tied together by the cruelty of her insult, and still I refused to bow. I straightened in my chair, lifted my chin, and let the silence do what words could not. My gaze was steady, unbroken, a quiet reminder that strength is not measured in volume or bravado, but in the ability to withstand humiliation without losing oneself. The confrontation ended not with her victory, but with her exposure. Her voice grew shrill, desperate, while mine never rose. Around us, the atmosphere shifted, the tension no longer weighing on me, but pressing in on her. The more she tried to assert dominance, clearer it became. The old and weak elder she mocked was the one holding steady. While she unraveled before the eyes of everyone present, what she wanted was to break me. What she achieved was to reveal her own cracks. And as the evening closed, I carried no triumph, no outward show of conquest, only the quiet certainty that dignity had prevailed over cruelty. The breaking moment had come, and it was not mine. It was hers each. Slight, each smirk, each condescending remark was fuel. Not for anger, but for clarity. I saw more clearly with every moment that her vision of power was shallow, built on arrogance and disrespect. She thought belittling me gave her strength, but all it did was expose her weakness. And so I remained composed. Where she mocked, I endured. Where she dismissed, I observed. Quietly, patiently, I let her show the family who she truly was, while I held within me the unshakable truth of the will already signed. She thought my silence meant defeat. She could not see that my silence was preparation, the calm before the reckoning she never saw coming. The house grew quieter after that fateful night. But the silence was not deceit, was a silence weighted with whispers, glances, and questions that no one dared ask aloud. The insult lingered like smoke in the air, impossible to clear, clinging to every conversation and every interaction. What she had said was not just a casual jab. It was a wound to the very fabric of family trust. A public dismissal of the respect owed to me as an elder. In the immediate days that followed, I noticed this shift. Some relatives, eager to avoid discomfort, pretended nothing had happened. They spoke of weather, work, and daily routines, their words carefully tiptoeing around the moment. Yet, even in their avoidance, I saw it in their eyes, the memory of her words echoing, reshaping how they saw both her and me. Others, less skilled at disguise, let their unease slip in the form of awkward silences and strained politeness. They were caught in the middle, uncertain whether loyalty belonged to tradition or to ambition. There were, of course, those who aligned themselves with her. They laughed lightly when she spoke, as if her arrogance was charm. They excused her disrespect with phrases like, "she didn't mean it," or "that's just how young people talk these days." Their words stung almost as much as hers had, for in defending her insult, they diminished the pain it carried. It was not just a matter of age or pride, was a betrayal of values that once bound us tightly together. Neighbors, too, began to murmur. In the market, while picking vegetables, I overheard a pair whispering, "Did you hear what she said to them?" Their tones carried both shock and curiosity, the kind of gossip that spreads like wildfire but also contains kernels of judgment. Others asked more directly, with sympathetic eyes, "Are you all right?" They may not have known the details of the will, but they knew something had cracked within the family walls. And cracks in one household quickly become talk for an entire community. Every family gathering after that was steeped in tension. The warmth of shared meals, once filled with laughter and stories, now carried a stiffness that no amount of polite smiles could ease. Her presence at the table was both commanding and isolating. Some leaned toward her, others leaned away, and in that subtle geometry of chairs and glances, alliances revealed themselves. Even my daughter, torn between love for her parent and loyalty to her spouse, moved cautiously. Her silence louder than any declaration could have been. But beneath all the discomfort, one truth stood firm. Respect once lost is not easily restored. Her insult had not just been about me. It had been about the principle of what binds families together: trust, gratitude, and honor for the sacrifices of those who came before. By dismissing me as old and weak, she had dismissed the very foundation on which her own comfort now rested. And everyone, whether they admitted it aloud or not, could feel the betrayal in that truth. For me, the aftermath was not just about external judgment, it was an internal reckoning. I allowed myself moments of grief, not only for the sting of her words, but for what they revealed, that arrogance could grow unchecked within the very heart of family. Yet, within that grief, I found clarity. The insult, harsh as it was, had exposed fractures that were already there. Fractures that needed to be faced rather than ignored. The community's whispers would fade in time, but the shift within the family was permanent. Lines had been drawn, loyalties tested, and the weight of betrayal etched into our daily lives. I understood then that this was no longer about an isolated insult, was about the kind of legacy I wanted to preserve, one that could withstand even the sharpest of words. Each slight, each smirk, each condescending remark was fuel. Not for anger, but for clarity. I saw more clearly with every moment that her vision of power was shallow, built on arrogance and disrespect. She thought belittling me gave her strength, but all it did was expose her weakness, and so I remained composed. Where she mocked, I endured. Where she dismissed, I observed. Quietly, patiently, I let her show the family who she truly was. While I held within me the unshakable truth of the will already signed, she thought my silence meant defeat. She could not see that my silence was preparation, the calm before the reckoning she never saw coming. Long before her words cut through the air, long before the family began to shift and splinter, I had already set my course. Experience had taught me that storms, though unpredictable, are inevitable, and the only defense is preparation. Watched the patterns, felt the subtle shifts in tone and behavior, and I knew enough of human nature to recognize ambition when it simmered beneath polite smiles. That was why the will had been drafted and signed in silence, each clause a shield, each page a safeguard for the legacy entrusted to me. The process had not been rushed. I had walked into the offices of trusted legal advisors with steady steps. Not as a victim fearing betrayal, but as a guardian intent on preserving what generations had built. Together we pored over documents, reviewed deeds, clarified ownership, and wove protections so tight that even the boldest arrogance could not slip through. Every signature I placed on the page carried not just ink, but intentioning, act of foresight. A declaration that no one's disrespect could dismantle. What had been earned through decades of labor and sacrifice. What gave me strength was the dignity in the approach. There were no grand announcements, no need for dramatic declarations. Preparation thrives in silence, and so I carried on my days as though nothing had changed. To her, to others, I may have seemed passive, old, and irrelevant. Yet behind that facade of quiet composure, layers of defense were being built, strong enough to withstand betrayal, yet subtle enough to appear invisible. I remember the calm satisfaction of sliding the final folder across the lawyer's desk, the embossed seal pressed firmly on the documents. It was more than paper, was protection. Property, savings, and the inheritance of future generations had been secured in a way that required no approval from those who underestimated me. The will was not simply a legal instrument. It was a symbol of resolve, a quiet declaration that foresight would always outlast arrogance, even as she mocked and dismissed me. I found comfort in knowing she was playing a game already lost. Her words, sharp as they were, struck only the surface. Beneath it, the foundation was unshakable. Every insult she delivered only highlighted the gulf between us. She relied on bravado. I relied on preparation. She wielded arrogance like a weapon, while I held patience and strategy as armor. And so, when I walked through the halls of the family home, when I sat quietly at gatherings, I carried not bitterness, but assurance. For I knew what she did not. The story had already been written, the outcome already secured. Her underestimation was her weakness, my foresight, my strength. In that contrast lay the true power, not in revenge, not in confrontation, but in the quiet certainty that dignity, once fortified by preparation, can never be erased. Each slight, each smirk, each condescending remark was fuel, not for anger, But for clarity, I saw more clearly with every moment that her vision of power was shallow, built on arrogance and disrespect. She thought belittling me gave her strength, but all it did was expose her weakness. And so I remained composed. Where she mocked, I endured. Where she dismissed, I observed. Quietly, patiently, I let her show the family who she truly was. While I held within me the unshakable truth of the will already signed, she thought my silence meant defeat. She could not see that my silence was preparation, the calm before the reckoning she never saw coming. At first, she carried herself with the same swagger that had always marked her presence. Convinced that her sharp tongue and dismissive tone could bend the family to her will. For a time, she even believed her insults had struck deeply enough to leave me diminished. But arrogance, when unchecked, has a way of turning on its wielder. The tide began to shift the moment whispers of the signed will began to surface quiet. Confirmations that her assumptions had been built on nothing but sand. She had imagined me powerless, an obstacle easily brushed aside, yet reality began to betray her fantasies. Each time she tried to assert authority, speaking over others, making decisions as though the legacy were hers, Alanchi was met with quiet resistance. Family members who had once stayed silent now questioned her motives. Where her words once carried weight, now they seemed hollow, tinged with desperation rather than confidence. The community, too, began to notice. Reputation is fragile, and hers began to crumble under the weight of her arrogance. Neighbors who once humored her dominance now exchanged knowing glances, whispers trailing in her wake. Didn't she know? The will was already signed. Though words spread like wildfire, each retelling a small erosion of her standing. What she thought was power was revealed as bluster. And bluster without substance cannot endure. Behind closed doors, her frustration grew louder. She argued with anyone who dared to challenge her, blaming conspiracies, accusing betrayal, lashing out with venom that only isolated her further. Even those who had once tolerated her behavior for the sake of harmony found themselves retreating. Where there had once been gatherings filled with chatter and laughter, silence now settled in her presence. Chairs pulled back, conversations ended abruptly. The air thick with discomfort, she tried desperately to claw back control. Legal threats were muttered, documents demanded, alliances sought. But each attempt collapsed under the simple, immovable truth. The will had already been signed. There was no loophole to exploit, no weakness to seize upon. Every safeguard had been anticipated, every avenue closed with precision. Her arrogance had blinded her, and by the time she realized the depth of her miscalculation, the walls were already closing in. The most painful collapse was not external, but internal. I could see it in her eyes, the flicker of disbelief when her words no longer commanded attention. The tremor in her voice when her proclamations went unanswered. Her power had never been rooted in real authority. It thrived only in others' willingness to tolerate it. Now that tolerance was gone, stripped away by her own cruelty and my quiet preparation. Days turned into weeks, and her isolation grew. She lingered at the edges of family gatherings, no longer the center of attention, but a shadow, tolerated rather than welcomed. Where once she looked upon me with disdain, now she avoided my gaze. Unable to reconcile the image of weakness she had clung to with a strength that had silently outmaneuvered her. Her collapse was not dramatic. It was slow, suffocating, inevitable. That is the cruel irony of arrogance. It consumes itself. She had mistaken my silence for weakness, but it was silence sharpened into strategy. And when the truth of the will finally settled into her understanding, she found herself alone, stripped of influence, left with nothing but the bitter taste of defeat in the end. She did not fall with a roar, but with a whisper, her arrogance, reduced to echoes no one cared to hear. The legacy she thought she could seize was forever beyond her grasp, safeguarded not by confrontation, but by foresight and dignity. Each slight, each smirk, Each condescending remark was fuel, not for anger, but for clarity. I saw more clearly with every moment that her vision of power was shallow, built on arrogance and disrespect. She thought belittling me gave her strength, but all it did was expose her weakness, and so I remained. Composed where she mocked, I endured. Where she dismissed, I observed. Quietly, patiently, I let her show the family who she truly was, while I held within me the unshakable truth of the will already signed. She thought my silence meant defeat. She could not see that my silence was preparation. The calm before the reckoning she never saw coming. When the storm of betrayal had finally passed, I found myself in a quiet place of reflection. The pain of being called old and weak lingered, but it no longer defined me. What remained was a deeper truth. Age does not diminish strength, and dignity is more powerful than arrogance. The entire ordeal had tested my composure, but it had also revealed the quiet resilience that had always guided me. I realized that true endurance is not about shouting the loudest or striking back in anger, it is about standing firm, preserving one's integrity and allowing time to prove the truth. Resilience, I learned, is not simply survival. It is the ability to endure humiliation without letting it hollow you out, to carry wounds, yet keep your spirit unbroken. In those moments when I was dismissed and underestimated, I could have retaliated with bitterness. But instead, I chose foresight and patience. The signed will was more than a legal document, it was a shield of preparation, a testament to the strength of planning in silence. Arrogance shouts for recognition. Foresight needs no applause. This contrast became my clearest lesson. Arrogance crumbles under its own weight, but dignity grows stronger in silence. She believed insults were weapons, yet they only revealed her own insecurity. I carried my quiet preparation as armor, and in the end, that difference defined the outcome. One path led to isolation, the other to respect. Healing did not come overnight. Words once spoken cannot be unsaid, and the memory of betrayal does not vanish with time. Yet what eased the pain was the support that began to emerge. Family members who had wavered now stood closer, acknowledging not just the insult I had endured, but the strength with which I carried it. Their presence was not loud or dramatic, came in small gestures, a reassuring hand on my shoulder, conversations laced with honesty, and a newfound respect that had been absent before. These reconciliations reminded me of what legacy truly means. It is not the wealth, the property, or even the signed will itself. Legacy is the example we set in moments of trial, the values we uphold when we are tested most. My legacy was no longer just the inheritance secured on paper, but that resilience and dignity my family witnessed in me. By facing betrayal without abandoning principle, I had shown them that strength is not measured by control, but by clarity of purpose. In time, the fractures began to heal. Relationships that had felt strained slowly regained warmth, built on transparency and respect. Younger members of the family, who had once stayed quiet, spoke of the lesson they had seen unfold. That preparation and patience triumph over arrogance and cruelty. In their eyes, I saw not pity for my age, but admiration for my resolve. That, perhaps, was the greatest healing of all. As I reflected, I came to see the insult not as an ending, but as a revelation. It had exposed the frailty of arrogance and confirmed the strength of foresight. It had reminded me that being underestimated is not a curse. It is an opportunity to prove one's worth silently, through action rather than words. And when the truth finally emerges, speaks louder than any insult ever could. The ordeal had begun with humiliation, but it ended with clarity. I had been called old and weak, yet I stood unbroken, my legacy intact. The lesson was simple, yet profound. Dignity endures where arrogance collapses, and foresight builds a legacy no insult can erase. They called me old and weak, and for a moment those words cut deep. They were meant to strip me of dignity, to reduce decades of strength and sacrifice into nothing more than frailty. Yet, as the dust settled, I realized the insult had never truly been about MIT, was a mirror reflecting their arrogance. What they underestimated was not just my resilience, but the foresight I had carried all along. The will was already signed, the legacy already secured, and no insult or manipulation could undo what had been carefully protected in that moment. I understood the essence of true strength. It is not measured in how loudly one speaks or how forcefully one acts. It is measured in wisdom, the kind that anticipates betrayal before it strikes. It is measured in preparation, the quiet signing of documents, the safeguarding of family history, the deliberate steps taken in silence. And most of all, 'tis measured in integrity, the refusal to let anger or bitterness dictate one's actions. What they mistook for weakness was patience. What they mocked as fragility was discipline. And what they failed to see was that dignity, once preserved, becomes an unshakable fortress. They believed they held power in words, yet the true power lay in the choices I had already made. The insult will linger as a memory, but not as a wound. It stands instead as proof of how easily arrogance can blind, and how quietly resilience can triumph. In the end, the will was more than ink on paper, was a testament to values, a shield for legacy, and a reminder that foresight always outlasts contempt. So when I look back, I no longer hear old and weak as an insult. I hear it as the beginning of a lesson, one that proved that strength is not about youth or dominance, but about clarity, preparation, and the courage to stand with dignity when others expect you to fall. That is the legacy I choose to leave behind, and it is one no insult can erase.